In this video, I'm going to be talking about this dot notation, something that's actually outside of the AP CSA subset. Not a lot of coding here, just a whole lot of explaining, so you can kind of sit back and just watch and learn. Here we go. I have student open here, and student has these four instance variables, right? First, last, ID, and GPA. So we've made some constructors here. I've actually overloaded the constructor. We have a no args constructor, that is, doesn't take in any arguments. This one only takes in 3, and we end up assigning a value, just hard coding in a natural 4.0. Solid, easy. Here I have a constructor that takes in 4 parameters, one for each instance variable, right? So what we're doing is that we're taking a string for our first name, we call it F right here, and we're saving it into the first instance variable. All right, I've got L, which I'm going to save into my last instance variable, I for ID, and then G for GPA. Okay, so to understand this dot notation, and as I said, this is actually outside of the AP CSA subset, meaning you don't have to know it, but I quite like it. I think you're going to like it, and you're going to see in our next video that if we use it, it's actually going to be to our advantage. IntelliJ is going to kind of, I don't know, go along with this dot notation, right? Kind of reinforce reasonings for knowing it. Anyway, this idea starts with something that's kind of obscure. And that is, now that we know instance variables, and we know that we have these things called local variables, right? Parameters or arguments, variables that are local to just the constructor or method. Okay, instance variables and local variables, as it turns out, are on like a separate ledger, a separate list from one another. What do I mean? I'm going to show you something a little wonky, right? Keep in mind, I have this instance variable called first. I'm going to rename this local variable first. Okay, that's of course going to break my code right here because F doesn't exist anymore, right? So we'll rename that first. What I want you to notice is I've got gray text, but not red text, meaning there is nothing syntactically wrong here. This is what I'm talking about. Instance variables and local variables are actually on like separate lists, if you will. I can have instance variables and local variables with the same name. Okay, the reason I like this, the reason I like having local variables and instance variables with the same name is because I don't want to come up with new names, right? Those little simple one-letter variable names, they're not very good. This is clearly going to be my first name. And so I like to call it first, but here's the problem. Notice this text is gray. If I actually hover over this, IntelliJ is telling me that it's a redundant assignment. I'm saving first into first. Here's a problem. Now that we have instance variables and local variables with the same name in the same scope, we need a way to differentiate between the two. How do I know when I'm talking about my instance variable versus how do I know when I'm talking about the local variable? And that's what this dot notation is. What do I mean? I'm going to come in here and say this dot first. And notice everything goes hunky-dory. Notice the coloration in this text versus the coloration in this text. Here's what we're doing. We are taking the local variable first and saving it into the instance variable first. What this dot notation effectively means is this object, right? The first belonging to this object. And we've actually seen kind of similar notation before. There's a video a while back where I talked about the reason why instance variables are private, and we were able to refer to a variable from another class. Let me quickly kind of show you and kind of jog your memory. I'm going to make GPA public. If I flip over to my driver, right, and I've got several students here, I'm going to get rid of a lot of them. Let's keep maybe Jennifer Gardner around here. So I've got a student object, stud, Jennifer Garner with a 505 ID and a 5.0 GPA out here killing it. And I just made GPA public. Normally I would not be able to access it. But now that it's public, I actually can directly access it. I can take stud, this student object that's here, and I can do simply GPA. Right? If I want to print that out, let's say, work with me here. I'm going to do an S out on stud.gpa. This isn't a method, right? There's no parentheses here indicating parameters. I'm referring to the instance variable directly that's inside stud. What I want you to look at is this notation, right? I have the object dot instance variable. That's a similar notation that we have going on here. Right? This object's first instance variable. So here's the concept. We can have instance variables and local variables with the same name. I need a way to differentiate between the two. That's where this dot notation comes in, right? This is saying this object's first variable, as opposed to just simply first, the local variable. I'm going to update the rest of these, right? L is last, I is going to be ID, and G is going to be GPA. What this allows me to do is now say this dot last is equal to last. This dot ID is equal to ID. And lastly, this dot GPA is equal to GPA. The reason why we as programmers like doing this is because this ends up looking really clean, right? Those variables that I have up here, F, L, I, and G, those aren't very good variable names. They're not very descriptive. First, last, ID, GPA, super descriptive. I know exactly where these variables need to go. However, there's a bit of a conundrum where I need to way to differentiate, and that's where this dot comes in. I like using this basically everywhere where I need to. What do I mean? Again, these variable names right here, they're not great, so I would do something like string first, string last, and int ID, and I would update these. This dot first is equal to first, this dot last is equal to last, and this dot ID is equal to ID. Okay, so I basically only use this dot notation if I need to differentiate between them, and that's very common in constructors. You'll also see it in setters. Oh, it looks like it's updated this for me. Interesting. Maybe I was playing around with that with a different class. Anyway, here I have set last. Right? I had to come up with this new variable name. In theory, the variable name last was already taken. Now that we know instance variables and local variables are on separate lists, and we can actually have variables, instance variables and local variables with the same name in the same scope, that means this can just simply be last. But here, right, if I just say last equals last, what I'm actually doing is just saving the local variable into itself. What I want to do is update the instance variable as such. Right? I would continue this trend in with our setters and getters. Well, I guess just our setters, because our getters don't take in any variables, any local variables, parameters. And this may seem like a little extra, like, why would I do this? Well, again, we get smoother names, but what you're going to find is that IntelliJ and a lot of high-level IDEs, right, these programs that help you code Java, they're going to include these little things where you can auto-generate code. And I'm actually going to do another video right after this one showing you the auto-generation. And what ends up happening is it ends up creating setters that look like this. It ends up using this dot notation. That way, it doesn't have to come up with new variable names. And this ends up just being convention. I'll see you in the next one.